The sharpness of the cursed katana. This is a story about a katana that was kept at my grandfather's house, my father's family home. I had a cousin who was a year older than me, so I would often stay at my grandfather's house during long holidays like summer vacation. Every time I arrived at his house, I was always warned about the same thing. Don't touch the katana out of mischief, my grandfather would say. The sword was displayed in the alcove of my grandfather's room. When I was young, I obediently replied, yes, and never thought of touching it. However, as I reached around the fourth grade, I became more mischievous and started to deliberately misinterpret his words, thinking to myself, oh, so it's okay to touch it as long as it's not out of mischief, whenever I was warned. But there was never a chance to touch it anyway, so no problems arose. It was during the summer vacation when I was in the sixth grade. As usual, I went to stay at my grandfather's house. That day, my cousins and I played in the river from morning until we got tired. And after coming back, I took a nap in the guest room. That night was a festival night with a small night market set up. Everyone planned to go to the night market together, but honestly, I found it bothersome. Going to the night market with relatives, just walking around a bit, eating grilled squid and corn from the stalls, and then coming back home. There were no interesting lottery stalls, and I didn't have any friends other than my cousins, so it wasn't very fun. In the evening, I was told that it was about time to go to the night market. Everyone seemed to be already wearing their shoes and waiting at the entrance. By then, I had already woken up from my nap and was just lying around, but I pretended to be asleep. Even after being called several times, I remained silent and pretended to sleep. Then I heard my grandfather's voice saying, "He must be tired from playing in the river all day. Poor thing, let him sleep." So everyone left, leaving Grandma to look after the house, saying, "We'll buy something delicious as a souvenir for you two." Grandma seemed to be watching TV in the living room. I lay around in the guest room for a while, but I got bored and got up to watch TV. That's when I noticed that the sliding door to my grandfather's room next door was slightly open. Through the gap, I could see the alcove in my grandfather's room. The katana was there. I thought the chance had finally come. I quietly entered my grandfather's room, careful not to let Grandma in the living room notice. When I lifted the katana from its stand, it was heavier than I expected. I slowly drew the sword out. I placed the scabbard on the tatami mat and swung the sword 2 or 3 times, but it felt like I was being swung around by the weight of the katana. I stood the sword up and looked at the glistening blade, and gradually, I couldn't take my eyes off it. The more I looked at it, the more I felt drawn to it, and I felt a strange sensation, as if I were breathless and filled with a bittersweet ache. I wondered what this gleaming blade with its dewy sheen would feel like. With that thought, I gently pressed the blade with my palm and felt a throbbing sensation, not quite pain, but more akin to an itch. When I looked at my palm, there was a faint white line where I had pressed the blade. Interesting. Oh, interesting. Thinking that, I gently pressed and released, savoring the throbbing sensation that was not quite pain, but more akin to an itch. Grandma's voice calling me from behind startled me, and at that moment, I felt an unbearable pain in my palm, and a moan escaped my lips. When I looked at my palm, I saw several deep cuts running across the entire palm, causing the flesh to overlap in a series of ridges, like a Hasselback potato. At first, it didn't look like cuts, and I couldn't understand what was happening for a moment. Without thinking, I opened my palm slightly. The next moment, blood gushed out from the deep wounds. Grandma saw my condition and, without panicking, brought a towel, made me grip it lightly, and took me to the local clinic at the corner of the street. The old doctor saw Grandma and me and said, "You've finally come," inviting us into the examination room. I kept crying loudly, saying it hurt. There were 6 or 7 deep cuts wide open, but the old doctor didn't disinfect or wipe away the blood. He told me, "Make a shape with your palm as if you're scooping water. Then, now keep your palm in that shape, hold it out in front of you, raise your hands straight up, and gently shake it back and forth." I did as I was told, crying. Blood was still flowing, but the only treatment was the old nurse occasionally wiping away the blood that flowed down to around my upper arm. Eventually, the old nurse said, "It doesn't hurt, does it? So stop crying." And I finally noticed that it indeed didn't hurt. After doing this for about 5 minutes, I was told, "Don't open your hand today." An oily paper with a thick layer of ointment was stuck to my palm, and on top of that, a wad of gauze was placed in my hand to grip lightly, and it was wrapped around and around with bandages so that my hand wouldn't open. They didn't even stitch it or take a closer look at the condition of the wounds. "If you rest quietly, it will mostly heal by tomorrow. Come back tomorrow, just in case," they said, and that was the end of the treatment. Even after being taken home, I felt somewhat awkward and couldn't even watch TV. So I stood behind Grandma and watched as she cleaned up my blood that had fallen on the tatami mats. Soon everyone who had gone to the night market returned. I thought Grandpa would be furious, but he didn't scold me. Grandpa just looked at the state of the house and said, "You finally drew it." Behind him, my uncles and aunts were saying something, but I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I didn't notice my cousin. Grandpa said that this katana is a kind of cursed sword, and no matter how much you are warned not to draw it, there will always come a time when you end up drawing it. If you are told beforehand that this is a cursed katana with a terrifying sharpness, you will inevitably want to test its sharpness on something. The urge to slash at people or animals will become irresistible. However, if you are not informed that it is a cursed sword, even if the time comes when you hold the katana, you will not feel the urge to cut someone. You will only end up hurting yourself by doing something like touching the blade. That's why, if possible, they want to hide such a katana. But if they put it away somewhere out of sight, it will bring curses in its own way, so they can't do that. It's good if you can get your hands on it while you're still young enough to call it a child's mischief. But it's troublesome if you miss that chance. As you get older, from middle school to high school, university, and even adulthood, it becomes more difficult to deal with. That's what Grandpa said. At the time, I thought if that's the case, they should just hand it over and say, "Try drawing it." But now I understand that it wouldn't work. In other words, I guess it doesn't work if you do it with permission. When you break a taboo that you've been told not to do, you're being tested for something. "It cuts terrifyingly well," Grandpa said. "In manga, there's an expression where a flash runs across the screen, and after taking 2 or 3 steps, the body splits in half, or it crumbles into pieces with the sound of the sword being sheathed. The same thing happens with this katana." Of course, Grandpa didn't do such a thing himself, but that's what he heard. Grandpa also said that because it's a cursed sword, not a famous sword, it cuts through anything. He explained that if you were to stand a sword in a small stream with the blade facing upstream and float a sheet of Japanese paper from upstream, a famous sword would cut the paper in half when you think cut. But when you think don't cut, even if the paper touches the blade, it would flow downstream without being cut. However, because this particular katana is a cursed sword, no matter what you think, if the paper touches the blade, it will be cut in half. Grandpa told me that when my palm was cut, I probably didn't even notice it was cut at first and didn't feel any pain. All the men in our family end up like this: Grandpa, my uncles, my father, and my cousin. The men before Grandpa were the same. They all secretly touched the katana and got seriously injured. "Men are really stupid," Grandma laughed. Later, when I asked my cousin where he had cut himself, he rolled up the hem of his shorts and showed me his left thigh. Around the middle, there was a very thin, barely noticeable horizontal white line. In my cousin's case, after searching around for something to cut, he decided to try shaving his leg hair. So he put the blade on his thigh and pressed it a little, and with a slight sensation like a gentle pop, the sword's blade sank into his thigh. With a feeling of, huh? He didn't understand what was happening at first. He cautiously applied a little more pressure, and the blade sank further into the flesh of his thigh. It didn't look like it was cutting, but what did it mean for the blade to sink in? That question popped into his head, but he didn't stop. There was a strange sensation in his thigh, heavy and itchy. In the end, when the blade had completely sunk in, he thought, "No, this must be cutting, right?" and twisted the blade a little, and the wound opened up and intense pain hit him. The strange thing is, once you draw it from the scabbard, you lose all interest and don't even notice it anymore. Everyone seemed to be the same. The parasite's paradox, a modern infection, It was about 4 years ago, in late February, when the chill of winter still lingered in the air. That night, around 8 o'clock, my friend Masaki unexpectedly showed up at my student apartment. As soon as I opened the door, Masaki started speaking rapidly. "Hey, I have something on my mind, a problem I need to talk to you about. It's a bit hard to explain over the phone. I think it's quite serious." Taken aback, I asked him, "What's going on?" Masaki hesitated for a moment before lowering his voice and replying, I think I might have some kind of weird parasite." I couldn't help but chuckle, much to my own embarrassment. As a college student at the time, the word parasite already sounded bizarre and almost comical to me, and to think that my friend believed he had one, Masaki's grave expression only added to the absurdity of the situation. "What's that all about? Did you go to the student health center?" However, Masaki maintained his serious demeanor and replied, "No, I don't think going to the student health center would help." Masaki's story was fragmented and difficult to follow. I invited him inside to explain in more detail, but he refused, saying, "No, let's talk here. I don't want to come into your apartment." His behavior must have made me look at him suspiciously because Masaki quickly continued, as if to justify himself. "No, it's just a precaution. There's a chance it could be contagious to others." "Wait, it's contagious?" "No, that's not it. It's really just a precaution. To be honest, I'm not even sure if it's actually a parasite." I insisted that it was too cold to talk outside and that we should discuss it inside. Perhaps resigning himself to my suggestion, Masaki finally stepped into the entryway and closed the door behind him. He didn't seem to want to fully enter my apartment, so he sat down just inside the doorway and began to talk, carefully choosing his words. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume it's a parasite. The thing is, there's an incident that comes to mind. I think it was probably during that picnic under the plum blossoms we all went to. You remember the cup salads Rico made? Well, I was the only one who ate them. The picnic he was referring to had taken place just a few days before Masaki's visit over the weekend. We had heard about a nearby nature park with a plethora of plum trees in full bloom, and that it had a lovely atmosphere with the faint, sweet, and tangy scent of plum blossoms wafting through the air. So the four of us from our casual college group decided to go for a picnic under the plum blossoms. For lunch that day, we each brought a dish to share. Rico was the one who brought the cup salads. They were in clear plastic cups with lids, filled with an assortment of steamed vegetables, boiled beans, and a homemade dressing that she had prepared separately. There was one cup salad for each person, and just as we were about to distribute them, Rico suddenly let out a scream, "Oh my gosh!" She frowned and lifted each cup salad, intently examining the contents. I saw something that looked like a whitish grub-like creature. For us college students, such an incident was more entertaining than anything else, and we made quite a fuss, laughing and squealing. Rico kept saying, "It was huge, much thicker and longer than my finger," as she repeatedly lifted the cup salads to double-check. We also received our cup salads and swapped them with each other to investigate, but we couldn't find the oversized grub that Rico had described anywhere. "Rico, you must have been mistaken. If it was that big, we would have spotted it without having to check like this." However, Rico started saying, No, it's really gross," and began collecting the cup salads from everyone. At that moment, Masaki said, "Rico, you're seeing things. There's nothing there. It's all good." And he opened the lid of the cup salad he was holding, poured the dressing over it, and devoured it all. We also told her, "You must have been seeing things. Let's dig in." But Rico insisted, "Absolutely not. I can't," and put the cup salads away in the basket. As a result, Masaki was the only one who ended up eating the cup salad that day. Masaki continued his story as he reminisced about the events. "I've gone over my recent lifestyle countless times, but I haven't done anything else out of the ordinary. If it is a parasite, the only thing that comes to mind is that salad incident. Why do you think it's a parasite? Is your stomach bothering you or something?" "No, I'm not feeling ill anywhere, but something that resembles parasite eggs keeps coming out of my mouth." "Whoa, are you for real? It's all right. They don't come out when I'm talking like this. Oh, right. Could you fetch me a glass of water? A clear glass would be preferable, if possible. At Masaki's request, I handed him a glass filled with water. I'm going to drink this water now, so I need you to verify that I'm not doing anything suspicious. Listen carefully. I'm going to drink the water normally. I won't spit anything from my mouth back into the glass. Please observe closely. As instructed, I watched intently as Masaki drank the water. He was drinking quite ordinarily. He didn't return any water from his mouth to the glass, and I didn't notice him doing anything questionable. After setting down the glass, Masaki said, "Tissues, and also a paper plate or something would be ideal," as he glanced around the room. Fortunately, I had some leftover paper plates from the picnic stored in the kitchen drawer. I handed Masaki the tissues and paper plates, and he placed a paper plate on the floor and began layering tissues on it, one sheet at a time. After stacking about 10 sheets, he slowly poured the remaining 1 centimeter of water from the bottom of the glass onto the tissues. Take a look at this. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that something transparent was falling out along with the flowing water. Plop, plop, plop. On the damp tissues, there were 5 or 6 colorless, translucent, jelly-like objects, each about 1 centimeter in diameter. They were shaped remarkably like fig fruits. They resembled spheres that had been pinched and stretched at one point, with a plump, elongated section. What the heck is this? Is it alive? No, it doesn't move or anything. Hey, you watched me drink the water, right? I didn't spit anything from my mouth into the glass, did I? No, you didn't. When I asked what this was, Masaki didn't answer directly, but instead said, "Do you have a needle or a thumbtack? Anything with a sharp point will do." I rummaged around and found a safety pin, which I handed to Masaki. Masaki pressed the tip of the safety pin against the jelly-like substance. It seemed tougher than it looked, as the pin didn't pierce through immediately, and the surface of the jelly dimpled as if resisting. As Masaki applied more force, it quivered as if it had popped, and the contents slowly spread out. As we left it alone and watched, the countless granules seemed to dissolve and seep into the tissue, disappearing from sight. What do you think? Hey, what did it look like to you? It looked like eggs inside an egg sack, right? I thought so too. Hey, take a look inside my mouth. Nervously, I peered into Masaki's mouth as he asked, but I couldn't find anything particularly noteworthy. Masaki showed me the underside of his tongue and pulled back his lips to show his gums, but there were no concerning signs anywhere. Okay, watch closely. Saying that, Masaki kept his mouth open and began to slowly lick the inside of his lower lip with the tip of his tongue. Immediately, 2 more jelly-like substances appeared in succession. Plop, plop. They were wedged in a distorted shape between his tongue and lip. Hey, they came out. See? Masaki said and spat the transparent granules onto the tissue from earlier. Where did those come from just now? I don't know. Whether it's from the lips, gums, or the tip of the tongue. I've tried many times, but I can't tell where they're coming from. When do they come out? They come out when I drink water, but there seems to be some condition. Like earlier, they usually come out when I drink water from a glass. But conversely, they don't seem to come out when I scoop water with my hand to drink. Also, they come out when I lick the inside of my lower lip, like just now. When did you first notice this? Masaki began to explain that he had noticed it this afternoon. At that time, he was playing an online game. He was drinking water from a convenience store, poured into a coffee cup he had at home. Engrossed in the game screen, he wasn't paying attention to how much water was left in the cup. When he brought the cup to his mouth, he realized it was nearly empty. As he was about to pour more water, he suddenly stopped. The surface of the small amount of water remaining at the bottom of the cup appeared to be bulging unevenly. He spread tissues on the desk and emptied the cup's water there, finding this disgusting thing. At first, he thought it had been mixed in with the bottled water. He spread a towel in the sink and emptied the rest of the bottled water there, but nothing came out. He felt sickened, thinking that he might have swallowed that thing. He cupped water directly from the faucet and rinsed his mouth several times. Then, almost unconsciously, he licked the inside of his lip to check, driven by a desire to confirm. There was a plop sensation. He screamed and spat the contents of his mouth into the sink. He rinsed his mouth thoroughly once more, checked again, screamed. After repeating this several times, he realized that this disgusting thing wasn't staying in his mouth, but was coming out from somewhere inside his mouth. Even so, at first he thought that this jelly-like substance might be some kind of body tissue. Although he didn't understand well, he thought that perhaps something like a whitehead had formed inside his mouth, or that his salivary gland function had glitched. Then, without much thought, he crushed the jelly on the tissue with his nail and was horrified. There were countless granules inside. At that moment, what came to mind was the large grub-like thing that Rico had claimed to have seen on the day of the picnic under the plum blossoms. He remembered that he had eaten the entire salad that supposedly contained it. Masaki's story seemed to add up, in my opinion. I could also tell from his complexion as he spoke that Masaki wasn't lying. According to Masaki, these jelly-like, egg-like things come out endlessly, as many as you want. That afternoon, he had tried to see how many would come out and filled a large coffee cup to the brim without stopping. Masaki hung his head and said, "I got too scared and stopped there, but I think even more would have come out if I had continued." I suddenly became curious. What did Masaki do with such a large amount of that grotesque mystery, which might be parasite eggs? "Did you throw it away?" When I asked, Masaki hung his head and shook it from side to side. At first, he thought about washing it down the sink or flushing it down the toilet. However, he realized that if this grotesque mystery were to multiply in the sewers, it would be terrifying. So he decided to boil some water in a small pot until it was about half full and pour the contents of the cup into it. He figured that if he kept boiling the mixture, the grotesque mystery would surely die off. He gently tipped the cup, careful not to spill or splash its contents, and as it flowed into the pot, a faint, hissing sound resembling a scream emanated. At the same time, a smell that made one instinctively turn away permeated the air. "A smell? What kind?" I asked, and Masaki replied, "Do you know the smell of a crushed earthworm?" I understood that well, as I had used earthworms as fishing bait when I was in elementary school. When piercing the earthworm on the hook, its feces, internal fluids, and mucus would stick to my fingertips. I remembered sniffing my slimy fingers back then and making a fuss with my friends saying, "It stinks." It had a unique raw smell that I had never encountered before. When I nodded, Masaki said, "It's similar to that, but not the same. It's more fishy and nastier. Anyway, it was an unpleasant smell." Masaki kept a small pot on the stove, continuously boiling until the water had completely evaporated. He thought there would be some kind of trace left behind, but there was nothing at the bottom of the dried pot. Masaki and I then spent over an hour searching the internet together. We translated and searched in various languages, but we couldn't find a single case with similar symptoms. Masaki's initial words, "I don't think going to the student health center would cure it," felt more real. Eventually, Masaki said, "I was feeling down, but talking about it made me feel a little better," and he left. As he was leaving, he said, "I'll take these with me," and put all the glasses, paper plates, and everything else in a plastic bag and took them home. In the end, Masaki didn't go to the student health center. Later, Masaki soon broke up with his girlfriend. I knew the reason because Masaki had told me. Considering the timing of when that grotesque mystery would appear, Masaki said that if it could be transmitted from person to person, it would be when kissing, or when someone drank from the same drink he had been drinking. Eventually, Masaki started coming to university less and less. I was worried and often visited Masaki's student apartment. By that time, those egg-like things were appearing more frequently than before and would sometimes fly out of his mouth with a plop while he was talking. Masaki was hesitant to attend university for fear of infecting someone. On the other hand, perhaps as a reaction to that, he began to seek interaction with others more than ever before. When I went to his student apartment, he would welcome me as if he had been waiting, and persistently ask me about the recent activities of our friends over and over again. What Masaki showed a particularly abnormal interest in was what his friends were doing and where they were at the moment. No matter how many times I explained, after a while he would want to hear the same story again. I tried to persuade him to go to the student health center many times, But whenever the topic of the student health center came up, Masaki would suddenly become emotional, vehemently argue against it, and never say he would go. Eventually, Masaki dropped out of university without waiting for graduation. Anyway, since I can't commute, I can't even apply for the jobs I'm aiming for. If I can't get a job, there's no reason to stay in university until the end, Masaki explained. Soon after, Masaki started working on data entry and transcription jobs that could be completed entirely online, and he moved to a place far from the city center. I still keep in touch with Masaki, but recently he told me that he's been cooped up in his apartment almost all the time. After completing his designated amount of work for the day, he spends the entire day playing online games nonstop. When I asked him if he was feeling unwell, concerned that he wasn't sleeping much, he replied, "I'm bursting with energy." He clarified that not sleeping doesn't mean he's become mentally ill and can't sleep. Rather, he's so full of energy that he doesn't feel sleepy or tired, so he doesn't need to sleep. That's why he usually sleeps only for an hour or two. And even the act of sleeping itself is just a habit he maintains because it's what he used to do. If he doesn't make a conscious effort to sleep, it's not unusual for him to go on for days without sleeping at all. Masaki believes that the eggs in the parasite are the cause of this unusual situation. According to his theory, the parasite might be trying to make him move around actively to spread the infection. He explained, "The fact that the eggs keep coming out means that the parasite is still inside my body. It's a well-known phenomenon that the behavior patterns of a parasitized host are altered to facilitate the spread of the infection." Masaki thinks that his extraordinary energy and ability to continue his activities might be the parasite's way of making him move around actively, increasing opportunities to interact with others and spread the infection. Unfortunately for the parasite, it chose to inhabit Misaki in the modern era. Nowadays, one can interact with others as much as they want through the internet. The more Masaki interacts with others through online games, the more the parasite is stimulated, producing more and more eggs and urging him to interact with others even more. Regrettably for the parasite, all those eggs go to waste. Masaki believes that his increasing energy day by day and the ever-growing number of eggs being produced might be attributed to this very reason. Come to think of it, I remember that when Masaki started missing university, he would persistently ask me about his friend's recent activities over and over again whenever I visited his apartment. Still, what concerns me is, eggs keep coming out. Are there that many? I asked, and Masaki said, "By the time I finish brushing my teeth, quite a lot has accumulated in my mouth. And recently I've noticed that they're coming out of my eyes too." When he rubs his eyes, many of those things fall out, plop, plop, plop. And sometimes I accidentally step on them when they fall on the floor, Masaki said with a self-deprecating laugh and a sigh. The Fate Adjuster. It's been a year since it happened, and as time passed, I couldn't tell if it was a dream or if it really occurred. I've decided to share my story. All right, I'll set it up here for you. One morning, I woke up in my room as usual, and those words were clearly lingering in my head. Huh? Set it up for you? When did someone say that to me? I tried to recall, but I couldn't. At first, I thought maybe it was said to me at my part-time job, but I quickly dismissed that idea. My job duties didn't involve setting anything up. Upon further reflection, I felt like it might have been said to me at home, but I couldn't think of any tools or machines that needed to be set up for me. I had a distinct feeling that the voice wasn't from a dream. Besides, if it were a dream, I would have likely forgotten such a vague memory of being told something without knowing why. Unable to remember anything despite racking my brain, I decided to forget about it, thinking, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter." Then as I approached my desk to prepare for university, I noticed something unfamiliar on it. Seeing it, I immediately thought, oh, that was it. Right, I was told, "I'll set it up here for you," referring to this object. But in what context? And who came to set it up? I couldn't recall the important details. Moreover, I couldn't even remember what this object on my desk was. Its shape was very simple. On a metal base, two objects that looked like dry cell batteries stood upright. The base was slightly larger than a deck of playing cards. I couldn't examine the metal material, but I thought it kind of looked like stainless steel. It had a sharp, angular shape, and the surface had a hairline finish. It felt meticulously crafted. On top of the base, two cylinders stood parallel to each other. They were about the same size as AA batteries. The tops of the cylinders were flat, with crisp, sharp edges, which also showed the careful craftsmanship. The cylinders had a luster and texture like polished stone. They had a slightly translucent, creamy color, and upon close observation, I noticed very faint hues of blue and red marbled together. That was all I could discern from the external observation, and there were no engravings or stickers indicating a company name or product name anywhere visible. I should have received an explanation on how to use this, but what was it? I tried to pick it up and examine it, but the base wouldn't budge at all, as if it were glued or otherwise fixed to the desk. While I was fiddling with the base, trying to move it and wondering, what's going on with this? I suddenly had a realization. I had a faint memory of being taught how to operate it after being told, "I'll set it up here for you." After some trial and error, I discovered that the objects resembling dry cell batteries could move up and down. In other words, this metal base had two circular holes, and the cylinders were inserted into those holes. The cylinders could be pushed in and conversely pulled out. The mechanism was extremely precise, with no visible gaps between the holes in the cylinders. Yet there was no jamming or catching. When carefully pulled straight up, they would smoothly rise, and when carefully pushed straight down, they would smoothly sink. The sensation almost felt slippery. However, there was something puzzling. The base was only about an inch thick, but the cylinders could be extended and retracted beyond that thickness. When I pulled a cylinder straight up, it could be extended more than 2 inches. Conversely, when I pushed it straight down, the part I had just pulled out would smoothly sink back in. Both cylinders could be freely extended and retracted independently, so they weren't linked internally. I couldn't even imagine how it was structured. I felt like I had been given an explanation about the internal structure, but I couldn't remember it. I got the idea to try pulling out a cylinder completely, so when I pulled one cylinder up about 4 inches, my heart suddenly started pounding. I felt tension and pressure. It was as if I was being forced to make a crucial decision and asked, "So which one will you choose?" When I tried to pull it up further, the pounding and pressure became unbearable. "I see, you're really going to pull it out, aren't you?" I felt a dreadful sensation, as if my action was being confirmed. For some reason, the thought that it would be bad stopped my hand. The tension was already unbearable, and in the end, I stopped trying to pull it up any further. Carefully pushing it back down to around its original length, I felt a deep sense of relief. If pulling it out was no good, I wondered what would happen if I pushed it in instead. That's what I decided to do next. As I carefully and slowly pushed it down, the tension gradually built up. When there was about an inch of the cylinder's length remaining, my heart suddenly started pounding. I felt the same intense tension as before. I tried to push it down just a little more, lightly poking the top of the cylinder with my fingertip, but perhaps due to my nervousness, I applied more force than intended and accidentally pushed it down by nearly half an inch all at once. "Ah!" I involuntarily let out a loud voice. I was so startled that my heart hurt. At the same time, I was assaulted by an unbearable pressure. "I see, you're really going to push it in, aren't you?" I felt as if I heard a voice saying that. I hurriedly tried to pull the cylinder back up, but by then the cylinder wasn't protruding enough to get a good grip. Unable to grasp it with my fingertips, I tried to pinch it between my middle finger and thumbnail to pull it up, but it was difficult to apply the right amount of force. Because I couldn't pull it straight up properly, the cylinder wouldn't move. On the other hand, if I tried to forcibly pull it up, my nail would slip or I would fail to pinch it properly, and the recoil might cause me to push it down even further. I don't know why, but just like when I tried to pull it out earlier, I had a conviction that fully pushing this in would be disastrous. I decided to stop for a moment and calm down. Then, I searched the internet to find out what this object was and if anyone had a similar experience. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a single hit. So I took a picture of it and tried a reverse image search. Similar shaped objects came up, but they were tools or machine parts, not the information I was looking for. However, at the very bottom, I found one image that looked just like the object in my room. The link led to a personal blog. Although the blogger's age wasn't mentioned, judging from several photos, they appeared to be around the same age as me. Skimming through the blog's content, it seemed that they usually posted about their travel experiences. One post, accompanied by an image, explained, "When I came back from my trip, I found this on my desk in my room." Reading the post, it said, "Even though I've warned them not to enter my room without permission, while I was away on a trip, they let in some unknown contractor who went ahead and installed this incomprehensible thing on my desk. When I complained to my parents, they said, 'It must have been a contractor you hired yourself.' And the conversation went nowhere." In the image, one of the cylinders was pushed down about halfway. Checking the post date, it was from 2 weeks ago. From that day on, there were continuous posts about this mysterious object, with images. The next day's post had an image showing both cylinders pushed down to about half an inch remaining. The post title was, "I might have noticed something amazing." Checking the content of the post, it simply said, "I need to test this out. If my hunch is correct, well, I'll report the results another day." The following day's post, the image showed the two cylinders back to their original length, with a pair of pliers placed on the desk next to them. The post title was, "I tested it." Checking the content of the post, it said, "Well, it turned out just as I thought. I'll wait a bit before announcing it. At this stage, one of my hypotheses has been confirmed. Since the movement becomes harder past a certain point, I even use pliers to test it. I have one more hypothesis left, so I'll do a final test tomorrow. Depending on the results, I might have a major announcement. Now, which one should I use for the test?" The post from the next day. Looking at the image, the cylinder on the right was completely pushed down, flush with the base. The post title was, "Yeah, I knew it had to be this one." Checking the content of the post, it said, "My other hypothesis was also spot on, but it was so accurate that I'm in the unfortunate situation of not being able to share the details. I'll leave a hint. I believe it will surely be a clue. The hint is that a certain thing became like the image in this post. In other words, it became flush, flat, or straight. It's something that originally beat at a nearly constant rhythm, but it became like that. If you've been reading this blog from the beginning, you can probably guess who I did this to." Even though the blogger called it a hint, I had no idea what they were talking about. So I read through the blog from the beginning. What I learned was that the blogger loved traveling and audio equipment. They were skilled with their hands and had a strong attention to detail, and all the speakers they owned were self-built. They lived with their parents. I also learned that they had a poor relationship with their family. There were several posts with such content. In particular, their conflict with their father was severe, and there were a few posts where they indirectly wished death upon him. This is just my imagination, but I think the blogger frequently went on trips to escape from that environment. I thought they should just move out, but there may have been circumstances that outsiders couldn't know about. However, I couldn't figure out anything beyond that. I had no idea what the hint meant. So I decided to test it out myself. I pulled out a pair of pliers from my toolbox and tried pushing the cylinder down like in the blog post. As I applied more force to push it down, the resistance grew stronger, just as the blog post had described. The resistance increased dramatically when there was less than half an inch left to go. Still, I pushed down with utmost care and attention to avoid accidentally pressing it all the way. But an overwhelming sense of pressure, guilt, and betrayal assaulted me, making me feel sick to my stomach. The blog author never mentioned how they felt about this in their posts, but I wondered what was going through their mind. As I was slowly pushing the cylinder down like that, I heard a loud sound of dishes shattering from downstairs. Rushing down to see what happened, I found my mother crouched down, clutching her chest. She was clenching her teeth and a groaning sound, "Ugh, ugh, ugh," was escaping from the back of her throat. Shattered dish fragments were scattered around her. Mom, what's wrong?" I called out to her. Then, still in that position, she turned to face me, weakly shaking her head with a grimace on her face. From the back of my mother's throat, a strained voice leaked out. "No." "Huh? What do you mean, no? Are you dying?" Those words unintentionally left my mouth. At that moment, for some reason I can't explain, An unbelievable thought crossed my mind. Ah, Mom, wait just a moment. I dashed up the stairs, skipping every other step, and used the pliers to forcefully pull back the cylinder I had been pushing down just moments before. Then, when I rushed back downstairs, my mother had a nonchalant expression on her face and was rubbing her chest, saying, that startled me. I told her that I would handle the cleanup, so she should go to the hospital, and I called a taxi for her. It's an incredible story, but in short, that's how it went. Those cylinders acted as a switch, and although I don't know the exact mechanism, pushing them down further and further began to interfere with the beating of the heart muscles. Pushing them down until they were flush with the base would completely stop the target's heart. The part in the blog post that mentioned something that beat at a nearly constant rhythm became flat was probably referring to the waveform of an electrocardiogram. The part that said who I did this to was about whose heart they stopped, either their father's or mother's. Based on the content of the other posts, they probably stopped their father's heart. Surely the target could be switched depending on which cylinder was pushed down. Considering that, it was fortunate that I happened to push down the cylinder on my mother's side. My father had already left for work at that time, and if I had pushed down the cylinder on his side, I would have undoubtedly pushed it all the way down until it was flush without realizing anything. Realizing this, I felt my legs begin to tremble, even though it was too late. Although it wasn't mentioned in the posts, I thought that if pushing the cylinders down stopped the heart, pulling them out might cause cerebral blood vessels to rupture. The fact that I felt guilt and pressure when pushing the cylinder down means that I had indeed received an explanation on how to use it beforehand. Although I had forgotten about it on the surface, I must have still remembered it subconsciously. The fact that I suddenly thought of the device's mechanism when my mother said no must also be related to that. Otherwise, there's no way I would have thought, my mother's heart is about to stop because I pushed the cylinder down at such a critical moment. After finishing cleaning up the broken dishes, I also went to the hospital, but there were no particular issues with my mother's heart. The ECG showed no problems, and the ultrasound examination revealed no issues with the heart muscles or valves. A few days later, she also underwent a chest MRI, but there were no inexplicable small shadows or anything else. Everything was completely normal. To prevent accidentally touching the cylinders, I used an acrylic board and hot glue to completely enclose that mysterious device. The URL of the blog where I found those posts started giving a 404 error 2 or 3 days later. About a week after that, one morning when I went downstairs, my mother asked me, "Your friend didn't stay over?" I had no recollection of this at all, so I asked her what she meant. She said that around 11 p.m. the previous night, I came down from the second floor and guided someone upstairs. Since it was late, she assumed my friend would be staying over. But when she checked the entrance hall this morning, there were no shoes, so she thought they might have left without her noticing. My mother's story didn't ring any bells for me, but I had a gut feeling about it. I hurried upstairs and the metal base and cylinders that had been installed on my desk were gone. The acrylic enclosure I had made and the traces of the hot glue had also completely vanished. In the spot where the base had been, there was an envelope. Inside the envelope, I found money equivalent to a few days' worth of part-time work, along with a single letter. The letter was handwritten with meticulous care in a handwriting that resembled a fountain pen. Compensation. Thank you very much for your cooperation in this investigation. We have prepared a modest compensation for you. Please accept it. Also, regarding this matter, as per the contract, please refrain from discussing it with others. A short while after I finished reading the letter, the characters began to fade and soon completely disappeared. All the images of that mysterious device that I had taken with my smartphone had also been deleted. I don't know if I deleted them myself or if the person who came last night tampered with my phone. Well, either way, it doesn't matter. I've also wondered why I never told my friends about that mysterious device on my desk or invited them over to show them when I had it. The notes said to refrain from discussing it with others, so I think I may have been hypnotically induced to do so. As for my mother's chest pain, I just happened to think of the connection at that moment, so I don't know if it was actually related or not. This isn't the kind of story I can share with my family. I can't confess that my mother's heart nearly stopped because I was fiddling with something I didn't understand. And if I had been unlucky, I might have completely stopped my father's heart without realizing it. In the end, I'm the only one who saw that mysterious device. And so I hadn't been able to talk to anyone about it until now. At the beginning, I said that as time passed, I couldn't tell if it was a dream or if it really happened. But the truth is, now I find myself leaning more and more towards the idea that it must have been a dream. That's probably why I've become able to talk about it like this. The unlikely guardian. In my grandfather's house, a large toad still lives under the edge of the veranda. Apparently, it settled there when my father was in kindergarten. At that time, its body length was about 2 inches, so it was probably an individual that had just been born about a year before. Year by year, it grew larger, and now its body length alone exceeds 10 inches, an exceptionally large size for a toad. During the day, the toad sleeps under the veranda. In the evening, when the sun sets, it crawls out from there. Then my grandfather brings insects and earthworms that he caught during the day. When my grandfather picks up the food with disposable chopsticks and shakes it in front of the toad's nose, it extends its tongue and gobbles it up. When the toad's belly is full, it raises its hands in front of it as if to say, "I'm good," and then crawls back under the veranda. Once it eats well, it seems to last for 2 or 3 days and doesn't come out every day. When my grandfather calls out to the toad hiding under the edge of the veranda, asking if its belly is full today, it peeks out halfway from behind a potted plant, shows its face, and then quickly retreats. It's like being kept as a pet in the garden, not quite a completely wild individual. In this way, the toad has been living for nearly 50 years. When I looked it up, I found that the lifespan of a toad in the wild is about 4 to 5 years. In captivity, it is around 10 years. I heard that among the individuals kept in research facilities, some have lived for more than 30 years. But the 50 years at my grandfather's place is probably living too long. In the past, there was a folk belief that those who have lived for an exceptionally long time become yokai, and somehow I can't help but nod in agreement. If it were in a different era, it might have been used as a tool for a kind of sorcery. In fact, this large toad does have some qualities of a yokai. It may sound a bit exaggerated, but the story goes that this toad saved my life. However, I don't remember anything about that time at all. It wasn't until much later that my grandfather and father told me about it, and I learned about it for the first time. The incident happened during a long holiday when I was in the first grade of elementary school. My grandfather's house is located in the middle of nowhere, at the foot of a mountain. That year, it seemed to be a peak year for Japanese pit vipers, also known as mamushi. We would spot them 2 or 3 times a day, and there wasn't a single day without seeing one. It's important to note that mamushi are venomous snakes native to Japan and can pose a serious threat to humans. Every year, it was a tradition for me to stay at my grandfather's house during the extended holiday period, but that year, my grandfather called my father and said, "There are too many pit vipers around this year and it's not safe, so don't come." However, I apparently threw a tantrum and insisted on going no matter what. So they had no choice but to decide that we would go, taking extra precautions. As soon as we arrived at my grandfather's house, the conversation turned to the mamushi. My grandfather mentioned that several of them had been slithering around the gate since morning, and he couldn't help but think that they were trying to get inside the house. Whenever my grandfather spots a mamushi, he immediately goes outside to try to catch it. But by that time, it quickly disappears into hiding, making it impossible to get rid of. Given the circumstances, they decided that whenever I wanted to go out into the garden, an adult would have to accompany me. It was the evening of that day. Apparently, I had ventured into the garden by myself. I must have snuck out on my own, taking advantage of a momentary lapse in the adult's attention. I have no recollection of the situation at that time. When my grandfather found me, I was crouching next to the gatepost, gazing up at the roof of the house. A short distance from my feet, a large mamushi had coiled its body into an S shape, poised to strike. My grandfather said that its body was as thick as my arm at the time, indicating its considerable size. I seemed oblivious to the presence of the mamushi. Between the mamushi and me, there was my grandfather's large toad. It had planted its hands on the ground, straightened its arms, and puffed up its body in a threatening posture, staring down the pit viper. My grandfather tried to rush to my rescue, but as he reached the front door, he found himself unable to move forward. Suddenly, he lost his nerve, and his legs froze. Every time he attempted to step forward, a vivid image of the large pit viper striking at me flashed through his mind. It was so shocking, as if he were witnessing the scene firsthand, that his body would involuntarily seize up. He couldn't distinguish whether it was just a figment of his imagination or if it was actually happening. Each time he mustered the courage to try to move forward, the same terrifying scene would play out in his mind, paralyzing him. My grandfather became convinced that if he made one wrong move, his worst fear would come true. He was completely overwhelmed by the presence of the large mamushi. The large mamushi wasn't targeting the toad, it was clearly aiming for me. It tried to lunge past the toad several times to get to me, but each time, the toad shifted its body to block the snake's path. Thwarted, the mamushi retreated, rapidly vibrating the tip of its tail, like a rattlesnake issuing a warning. As the standoff continued, both the mamushi and the toad's movements gradually became smaller and smaller until they were both utterly motionless, locked in a tense face-off. As for what I was doing during all of this, I seemed to be completely engrossed in something else entirely. My grandfather couldn't tell what had captured my attention so completely from where he was standing. It appeared to be something on the roof of the house, and I was apparently staring up at it, transfixed. Of course, I was blissfully unaware of the life-or-death drama unfolding at my feet. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. Suddenly, a faint, chime-like sound rang out, and the tension that had gripped the scene dissipated in an instant. My grandfather was filled with immense courage. Grabbing a broom nearby, he rushed over to where I was standing. He swung the broom with all his might at the large pit viper, and something incredible happened. The snake crumpled in on itself like a deflated paper bag. When he picked it up, he discovered that the large mamushi was now nothing more than an empty husk, its insides completely gone. Although he couldn't quite explain what had transpired, my grandfather realized that somehow the toad had emerged victorious in its confrontation with the pit viper. From that moment on, the mamushi, which had been a constant presence in the days leading up to this event, vanished without a trace. Apparently, in the midst of all the commotion, no one had been able to ask me about what I had witnessed. It wasn't until we were all seated around the dinner table that my grandfather finally broached the subject. "Earlier, when you were looking up at the roof of the house, what exactly did you see?" he asked. Piecing together my childish, fragmented account as best he could, my grandfather arrived at the following conclusion. It seemed that several celestial maidens had been perched in a row along the edge of the roof, pointing down at the ground below and giggling in amusement at the spectacle unfolding before them. As a gust of wind swept these ethereal beings aloft, a faint, shrill chime reverberated through the air. I had been trying to see where the wind was carrying them when my grandfather came running over, followed closely by my grandmother, mother, and father. They all made a huge fuss over me and quickly ushered me back inside the house. As a result, I never got the chance to see where the heavenly maidens had disappeared to. In my young mind, the events of that peculiar day had somehow been processed as nothing more than a vivid dream. The next day, when my grandfather tried to ask me about the incident again, he realized that I had completely forgotten everything that had happened. I couldn't remember a single detail from the day before. It wasn't until many years later, when I was in middle school, that I first heard this story. At a family gathering, someone brought up the incident and asked if I remembered it. Of course, I had no recollection of it at all. That was the moment I discovered the incredible events that had taken place when I was just a young child, a secret that had been kept from me all those years. Whispers from the Misty Peaks. Every year, people go missing in the mountains. Some are hikers who lose their way, while others enter deliberately, seeking to end their lives. Not all perish immediately, though. Among these lost souls, a few somehow adapt to the wilderness, melding into nature itself. These individuals who naturalize into the mountains are known as the mountain folk. Given their reclusive nature, encounters with the mountain folk are exceedingly rare. This is the tale of old Manji's brush with one such being, an event that occurred some 40 years ago, back in the late 1970s. That day, old Manji had ventured into the mountains for bird hunting, accompanied by his trusty hound. As noon approached with no prey in sight, they found themselves deep in the wilderness. Suddenly, the dog began to growl, its attention fixed on the forest ahead. Ji halted, instantly on guard. Experience had taught him that when his dog reacted to wildlife, anything from birds to boars could burst out at any moment. Carelessness could spell disaster, especially if it turned out to be a bear. There was also the risk of accidentally shooting another hunter if he fired without confirming his target. Tense and ready, Ji held his shotgun at the ready. A rustling sound emerged from the forest, moving away. Then about 90 yards down the trail, something appeared. It was a wild dog. Old man Ji's relief at it not being a bear was short-lived, as he spotted a pack of 6 or 7 more wild dogs further ahead. This ain't good, he thought. I'm no match if they attack. As he considered retreating, he noticed something else among the pack. A human figure. Well, human might be stretching it. While it walked on 2 legs, that's where the similarities ended. The being was completely naked, its skin the color of tree bark. Its hair and beard, if you could call them that, grew wild and unkempt. It wasn't particularly tall and looked painfully thin. With a hunched back, it approached Ji, bobbing its head up and down in an odd, repetitive motion. As it drew closer, a bizarre odor assaulted Ji's nostrils. Its eyes glinted with an animal-like ferocity, locking onto Ji with an intensity that was far from human. So they really do exist, Ji thought, utterly bewildered. He almost wished it was a bear or boar instead. At least then he'd know what to do. Should he shoot? Was it even human? What was the right move here? Ji had heard tales of the mountain folk from the elders, but they were always distant sightings. Saw one eating something or spotted one heading deeper into the mountains. Never had he heard of one approaching someone, let alone attacking. His confusion gave way to fear as the being closed in, now barely 20 yards away. Ji could hear its labored breathing. Huff! Ha! Unable to bear it any longer, Ji's finger instinctively squeezed the trigger. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the mountains. The being froze, clearly startled. The bullet had missed. In a flash, it darted into the forest and vanished. The wild dog pack seemed to follow suit, disappearing from view. Ji ran. The relief he felt upon reaching his village was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Excited, Ji spread the word about his mountain folk encounter to the villagers. To his surprise, their reactions were lukewarm at best, leaving him feeling somewhat foolish. He never spoke of the incident again after that day. The Echo Spirit. This incident took place in the 1980s. As old Manji entered the mountain, he heard a voice calling out, "Hey!" The voice was indistinguishable. It could have been a child or an adult, male or female. Thinking someone might be in need of help, Ji called back, "Hey!" In response, he heard another, "Hey!" Ji started moving in the direction of the voice. As he progressed, the "hey" grew louder. Ji continued to respond with his own "hey." This call and response continued as Ji made his way through the mountain. Finally, he came upon a river. There was no one there. For a moment, Ji felt as if the babbling of the river had stopped. In that instant, an unsettling sound erupted. It began as a low guttural rumble, quickly escalating into a frenzied, high-pitched cackle. The noise defied description, part laugh, part shriek, wholly inhuman. It rose and fell in unnatural waves, echoing through the mountains with a bone-chilling intensity. Ji says the sound was neither distinctly male nor female, but so loud and terrifying that it seemed to penetrate his very being. The unnatural laughter continued to reverberate long after it should have faded, as if the mountains themselves were mocking him. Ji ran away. To this day, he says he still doesn't know what that voice was. The Wandering House. In the mountains, and sometimes a house appears suddenly in a place where no one should live. This is known as the Wandering House. The Wandering House is a legend from the Tohoku and Kanto regions of Japan. It's said to be a phantom house in the mountains that brings wealth to those who visit it. According to the book Tales of Tono, describe it as a mysterious house that bestows fortune on its visitors, who are allowed to take something from the house. The house is always empty of people, and it's said that taking furniture or items from it can make you wealthy or bring you misfortune. Old Man G claims to have encountered the wandering house twice. The first time was around 1965, about 60 years ago. G was still young then, accompanying an experienced old hunter into the mountains. As they walked deep into the wilderness, they suddenly came upon a clearing with a house. It was a traditional Japanese house, like an old wealthy farmer's residence. Besides the main building, there was a separate quarters and a large storehouse. It was clearly a grand estate. The white walls were spotless, as if newly built. It made no sense for such a magnificent house to exist halfway up a remote mountain. As G wondered about this, the old hunter simply said, "Let's leave." The old hunter explained, "I don't know what that is, but it's certainly an illusion. Whether it's an illusion or not, you mustn't take anything from someone else's house. That's theft. You can't find happiness through wrongdoing." The second encounter happened when G was hunting with a young hunter nicknamed Yoichi. Yoichi got his nickname because he'd greet everyone, even his elders, with a casual yo without any sense of propriety. So people started calling him Yoichi, which stuck. Yoichi had a rather brazen personality and was overly familiar with everyone, which made him unpopular with some villagers. However, G found this familiarity somewhat endearing, so he often went hunting with Yoichi during this period. Deep in the mountains with Yoichi, G saw a house in an impossible location, near the mountain peak. There was no way a house could exist there. Moreover, it was a modern-looking house resembling something built in the 1980s. It appeared clean and new, as if just constructed. G thought, this must be the wandering house, and was about to leave. Yoichi asked, "G, what's that doing here?" G explained about the wandering house, repeating what the old hunter had told him years ago, but Yoichi wouldn't listen. Yoichi said it looked interesting, and he was going to take a look inside. Ignoring G's warnings, he entered the house. He soon returned saying, "Nothing there. No one's home. Boring." A week later, Yoichi died. They said it was sudden cardiac death. G speculates Yoichi might have taken something from the wandering house. The Spirit at the Charcoal Hut. This is a story from when Old Man G visited a mountain cabin with a small charcoal burning shed nearby. In the old days, people would stay at these places for days to produce charcoal in the mountains. G's friend owned one of these cabins with a charcoal burning hut. One day, this friend invited G over. He said it gets boring being cooped up in the mountains for days making charcoal, so he wanted some company to drink with. G and a couple of friends went to visit the charcoal burning hut. As the night wore on, they started drinking. The party got rowdy quickly, but soon it died down, leaving only G and his charcoal burning friend awake. Suddenly, G glanced at the window and saw a strange figure standing there. His friend, averting his eyes from the figure, whispered, "Don't make eye contact. It might take you away." At first, G thought he was seeing things due to the alcohol, but the figure was grinning and peering into the hut through the window. Its leering face was infuriating, but also eerie. Just then, his friend whispered again, "Don't look it in the eye." Heeding the warning, G looked away. After a while, thinking it might be gone, G looked back at the window. The figure had vanished. Later, G learned that this was some kind of mountain spirit. If you interact with it too much, it might take you away. No one knows where to. Old beliefs say the mountain spirit's a jealous goddess. Men working in mountains are like her grooms, so bringing women angers her. Other spirits might also snatch away women, like tonight's visitor. That's why they're especially wary of women entering the mountains. The Mountain Spirit. This story takes place around 1998, a relatively recent event. Hunters often stumble upon spots rich with wild vegetables or good fishing locations during their hunts. Usually they keep these places secret, not telling anyone, not even family. They take these prime locations to their graves as personal treasures. Old Man G had found several such spots for gathering wild vegetables. One day he went to one of these places accompanied by his hunting dog. Upon reaching the spot, G silently began picking vegetables. After a while, he sensed a presence behind him. When he turned around, he saw a woman standing there. She was a woman with narrow eyes dressed in white. G thinks she was in traditional Japanese attire, though he doesn't remember clearly. When their eyes met, the woman grinned. G says he had never seen a smile so eerie and unpleasant in his entire life. He was struck with fear and lost consciousness. He recalls that his dog jumped in surprise at the sight of the woman, almost like a scene from a cartoon. When G came to, it was already dusk. He hurried down the mountain. G believes that might have been the mountain spirit. The mountain spirit is said to be female. The fact that even the dog didn't sense her presence suggests she was no ordinary being. When I asked, "What did she look like?" G answered, "You know that comedian, Nakamoto Koji? She had even droopier eyes than him, with a square face." His description made me imagine Nakamoto in an apron. G continued, "I can't forget that creepy grin and those stark white teeth. It still haunts me." Unnaturally long, narrow eyes and red lips. He said it was like a face attached to a square block of concrete. G reflects, the mountains are scary, but as you get used to them, you tend to forget that fear. Many people who have lived in the mountains for years lose their lives because they forget to be afraid. I've survived my involvement with the mountains because I never forgot that fear. Just when I start to lose that fear, strange things like this happen, reminding me. I guess I've been lucky. As I listened, I thought G's words were quite profound and found his story fascinating. The Whispers of the Swaying Dead. My girlfriend's story. One day I went out with my girlfriend. I can't quite remember where we went. It was raining heavily. Droplets hung from the edges of our umbrellas, dripping steadily. Looking ahead, the cityscape was shrouded in a misty veil of rain. We decided to duck into a coffee shop for a quick break. Inside, dim orange lights floated in the shadowy interior. We were seated by the window. As I watched the raindrops on the glass, my girlfriend suddenly murmured, "I wonder why dead bodies sway." Confused, I asked her what she meant. She replied, "You know, when people die and become corpses, why do they sway?" Still perplexed, I pressed further, "What do you mean? In what situation?" She began to recount the first time she saw a dead body, back when she was in elementary school. It was when she was in second or third grade, on her way home from school. She had parted ways with her friends and was walking alone down a narrow street towards her house. Along that path stood an old house where an elderly woman lived alone. The house had dark wooden siding treated with creosote, which was occasionally reapplied, giving off a distinct odor. The window facing the narrow street was always open, and sometimes you could see the old woman eating what looked like cold rice. That day, a limp upper body was hanging out of the window frame. The dangling hand was swaying gently. My girlfriend approached, thinking perhaps the old woman had dropped something and she could help pick it up. But there was nothing on the ground. She moved closer to the wall and peered around to look at the face. The old woman was dead. Despite the lack of wind, the hanging hand continued to sway. When I asked how she knew the woman was dead, she said, "There were flies on her eyeballs licking the white part. You know how flies do that?" She thinks she went home and told her mother after that, but she doesn't remember clearly. Throughout elementary and middle school, she saw several people who had hanged themselves, one from a beam in the community center storage room, another from a magnolia tree in the park, and one more hanging from a clothesline on an apartment balcony. Even though there was no wind, they all swayed gently. The last incident was when she was in high school. A friend who commuted by bus came to school one day, saying she might have seen someone who had hanged themselves. As the bus passed through a residential area, she thought she saw someone hanging by a rope in the back of an old abandoned house. It was in the shadow of the building, so no one else seemed to notice. The bus passed by quickly, so she wasn't sure if she had seen correctly. That afternoon, only a close-knit group of 4 friends boarded the bus heading there. They might have agreed to keep it a secret from others. They got off at a nearby stop, made sure no one was around, and entered the abandoned house's gate. They made their way through the overgrown garden shrubs in the gap next to a prefab structure, heading towards the back. In the storage area by the back door, enclosed by corrugated panels, They discovered a man who had hanged himself. He had secured his necktie to a low crossbeam, resulting in an awkward position with his legs extended forward. His lifeless hands hung at his sides, swaying slightly in the still air. After telling me this much, my girlfriend fell silent and began watching the rain streaming down the window. While listening to her story, I had forgotten we were in a coffee shop. When I asked, could it have been a mistake? She firmly denied it. No, because I stopped the swaying myself. She said she was only afraid to touch a dead body the first time. With the old woman, the flies on the white of the eyes surely meant she was dead. But then why was her arm swaying? Maybe it was a mistake, and she was just unwell. Thinking this, she fearfully reached out her hand. The moment she touched the old woman's cold hand, something seemed to slither through her body from the point of contact. If asked whether the sensation was pleasant or unpleasant, she would definitely say unpleasant. Yet soon after, she found herself looking for hanging bodies, wanting to experience that slithering sensation again. When she stopped the swaying of the two whose hands were moving and the fourth who was hanging, they all sent that slithering feeling through her body. She said that slithering sensation was the last words of the dead person. It was as if they had let slip something they would never say in life, something hidden in the depths of their heart, at the very end. It felt like accidentally eavesdropping or peeking at something you shouldn't. I mentioned, come to think of it, I've only seen a dead person once when my grandfather died. He was stiff from rigor mortis. She replied, I think they'd sway if you hung them up. I don't remember how I responded to that. Around the time she told me this story, she started saying she didn't want anyone to know her last words. When I asked why, she said, because once you hear someone's last words, you'd understand. I don't know if this was the reason, but a few years ago, in June, she disappeared without a word to anyone.